right, welcome everyone. I see we have lots of participants joining in. We are just going to wait a couple minutes as more people continue to join, and we will start shortly. If you would like to share the webinar with anyone that does not have Zoom, feel free to direct them to the Center for Rural Affairs Facebook page, where we will also be live streaming this webinar to our Facebook. So you have a couple of different options to view.
I feel like we should have some like elevator music on or something.
Well, for the first video, we actually did have some Spotify music playing, but then we realized that we might get in trouble with some copyright issues with that.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So if anyone would like to start singing, we are more than welcome to do
All right,
that.
Dr. Adams, time for you to shine.
I'll pass. I don't think anybody wants that.
Yeah, I wish I had the singing talent, or just music or art. I feel like I'm not good at that.
Yeah, no, not so much.
All right, I think we will give it one more minute and then we will get this show on the road.
Wendy, I love that idea of having the Jeopardy theme song.
Now that I'm trying to think of it, I don't think I can actually put the Jeopardy theme song in my head. I'm just drawing a blank. All right, I think we can get started now. We'll probably have a few more people continue to join as the time goes on. But thank you all for joining in this third part of our Rural Experience series. The topic for today is mental health and race. There we go. So we are continuing the conversation today around race, identity, and the lived experience in rural parts of the country. In this webinar, we want to take a deep dive into how current events are impacting the mental health of people of color in rural Nebraska and in general. We will explore why it is important for us to bring the topics of both mental health and race together. Through this panel discussion, we will discuss how social injustice, historical inequities, and lack of access to adequate health care exacerbates mental health outcomes. The conversation today will be led by speakers Dr. Charmaine Adams, Assistant Professor at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, an independently licensed professional counselor, and Miguel Estevez, provisionally licensed mental health practitioner and provisionally licensed alcohol and drug counselor, working with the Friendship Home of Grand Island. Our partnership with the American Civil Liberties Union of Nebraska, the YWCA of Adams County, the YWCA of Grand Island, the Friendship Home of Grand Island, and the Center for Rural Affairs strives to bring real conversation, answers to the questions that we may have, and the opportunity to listen in and learn. So before we get into introductions, I just wanted to share the agenda so you know what to expect today. So we're going to go over kind of some housekeeping rules of how we're going to engage with this Zoom webinar, as well as some community rules for what we expect of all participants to engage in this discussion. And then we'll move into introductions before diving into the conversation then followed by the participant Q&A before we finish by sharing some resources we would like you all to have. So for the housekeeping rules, if you are new to Zoom, we encourage you all to use the chat function to talk amongst yourselves and share any resource or share any input with the panelists or myself. We won't be using the raise hand feature too much because we have a lot of information that we're going to go through today, but please do, if you have a question, use the Q&A button. And this will allow you to pose your questions to the panelists, and you can also upvote and comment on other questions that you see from other participants. So if you see a question that you would really like to have answered, please upvote that, and we will take as many questions as we can at the end from the most upvoted questions first. And yes, as Gladys just shared in the chat box, please share your name and where you're joining us from so we can start some discussion going on in the comments as well and the chat box as well. Let's see. And some of the rules that we have, these are kind of the rules that we have for all of our different activities, but we say respect for all. We respect each other and ourselves, including being mindful of one another's time. Dialogue is healthy when we critique ideas rather than people. We strive to be aware of the intent and impact of our actions, expressions, and body language. We care for ourselves and our community by keeping work and common spaces uncluttered and tidy. Bring our best selves. We are present in both body and mind. We refrain from blaming or shaming ourselves and others. We welcome different points of view and show empathy for our peers. We respect and understand that powerful emotions are expressed in different ways. We allow room for mistakes and leave assumptions, grudges, and other negativity at the door. Assume positive intent. We strive to be open to hard conversations and welcome feedback as a way to improve our work and interactions with others. We listen actively. We are willing to be surprised, to learn something new, laugh together, and listen with our whole self. I really like to highlight assume positive intent as a community rule. We always want to assume the best of each other and engage with the best intentions in mind. Step up and step back. We encourage full participation by all present. We recognize who is speaking and who is not. When we speak often, we step back by listening to others. And if we tend to be silent, we step up to share our experiences. And also, words have power. We are mindful that words have power and consider how our words will be received. We encourage curiosity and offer a safe space to share ideas. We listen to understand and are open to receiving feedback to improve our work. So our first panelist today is Dr. Charmaine Adams. Charmaine Adams is an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska at Omaha and an independently licensed professional counselor. Her clinical background focuses on working with individuals with a history of trauma or in crisis. Her research focuses on teaching about trauma, systemic and emotion-focused clinical interventions, and the application of attachment theory in clinical and academic settings. Both clinically and academically, Dr. Adams is focused on social justice counseling and empowering clients to examine barriers and use their strengths to overcome life's challenges. We're also joined by Miguel Estevez. Miguel is a provisionally licensed mental health practitioner and provisionally licensed alcohol and drug counselor. He holds a Bachelor's of Arts degree in biology and a Master's of Science degree in clinical mental health, both from the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Miguel is also a Grand Island Senior High graduate. Miguel believes his background as a first-generation US-born and growing up with parents from Guatemala and El Salvador help him understand the Latinx community and gives him a unique perspective. We are also joined by Gladys Godinez, who is running technology. She is my coworker at the Center for Rural Affairs, and she will be engaging with all of you in the webinar chat, as well as those joining in from the Facebook page. And I am Jordan Fireherm, also with the Center for Rural Affairs, and I will be moderating the conversation today. And with that, we will transition into the substance of our conversation today. of asking some questions. So for the first question, I would like to start with Dr. Charmaine Adams. Dr. Adams, this is kind of a two-part question, so feel free to take whichever part you want first. But why are we talking about the topics of mental health and race together? Or to put it in another way, how do race and access to mental health resources impact wellness?
Well, thank you, Jordan. Thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm excited to be a part of this and to be talking about these topics. And so I want to start by saying that the topics of mental health and the topic of race are two very huge topics independently. So when we smush them together, it is a lot to cover in an hour. So we're going to try our best to kind of give you all what we can, but also strongly encourage you all to dive into different resources that we talk about in the end and reach out if you have any additional questions. I also want to talk a little bit about terms. And so when we're talking about race, we're talking about a group of people that have physical characteristics that are similar. And when we talk about ethnicity, we're talking about a group of people that have cultural characteristics that are similar. And so an example of that is your race can be Black, but your ethnicity can be Jamaican, or it can be Colombian, or it can be Nigerian. And so I think throughout this conversation also, we're going to be jumping back and forth between talking about how race impacts mental health and how ethnicity impacts mental health. And so I want to point out that those terms aren't interchangeable, but we're going to be kind of hopping back and forth between those as we talk about this. So kind of to circle back to your question, there are a couple pieces that I want to start talking about for race and mental health. And so the first one is going to be our understanding of mental health or wellness in general is very, very culture bound. And so what it means by that is that our idea of kind of good mental health is based on our understanding of psychology, which has a foundation in kind of European white men telling us what mental health was. And we have kind of carried that generation to generation. And it's largely based on productivity, which is a very westernized, deeply held westernized value. It's been within about the past 10 to 15 years that we've really started to understand that mental health and our understanding of mental wellness needs to be more culturally responsive. We need to have an understanding of how individuals of various race and ethnicities view mental health and mental wellness. And so we have really kind of taken a step back from our understanding of health and wellness to take into consideration how race impacts it. And so the field of mental health in general, I think you could probably broaden that out to medicine in general, has had to take a really hard look over the past kind of 10 to 15 years on what it means to serve diverse individuals and what it means for their wellness. And mental health is not excluded from that conversation. So I'm glad we're talking about this. The research on this in the grand scheme of research in the field of psychology is relatively new, but we're just starting to understand how these two topics are intertwined. The kind of second piece of that is as we're taking a closer look at it, we're starting to understand that health and wellness is heavily impacted by how your family views health and wellness, how your community views health and wellness, and how your cultural values view health and wellness. And so taking kind of this broader look of if I have somebody that shows up at their general practitioner and says, I'm having really bad headaches and a really bad stomach issue, that might be anxiety showing up in a physical form, but they might never actually end up in front of a counselor, right? Their general practitioner might just treat the physical symptoms of it, and they might never actually make it to counseling. And so thinking about how distress shows up differently based on culture, based on race, is also another kind of important part of this conversation. And then the last piece that I wanted to bring up for this part is that race doesn't, in and of itself, make anybody more susceptible to mental health distress. But the social construct of race and privilege and oppression that is wrapped up in that does impact mental health and wellness. So when we're talking about how race and ethnicity impacts into how welcome people feel in their community, how welcome people feel at their job, um, how children are treated in the school system, right? Like all of these like socially constructed ways that race and ethnicity change what it's like to kind of move through this world. That is where we see an intersection between race and mental health. So there is no kind of genetic disposition that comes with race on whether you're going to be well or not. But I do think that there's these social constructs that really do broadly impact that, and why it's important to have an intentional conversation about how they're intertwined.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Adams. And I apologize for just jumping into the questions there, because you're right, this is a very big conversation, and it bears some a little bit of exposition of why mental health and race and those two conversations together, because each of them by themselves have quite a bit that we could talk about. So this is kind of just putting two very big conversations together. So thank you for giving a little bit of that exposition. And just before we turn to Miguel, I just want to greet the people that may have just joined this conversation. And if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A tab, and we will try and get to them here shortly. But with that, I'm going to turn it to Miguel. And same question, why are we talking about the topics of mental health and race together? And how do race and access to mental health resources impact wellness? And please feel free, if you feel there's any exposition that you would like to give, please feel free to start with that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity to have this conversation. I think I'm grateful for everybody that is in this webinar and is going to watch this webinar. I think you're here in a perfect timing. I think often as people of color don't often get heard, even if we're screaming and saying all this stuff that's been happening for centuries. I think we're getting in the point where people are starting to listen and starting to be empathetic of and checking themselves, like Dr. Adams said, about privilege and oppression, and having these conversations. So thank you for Rural Affairs for kind of putting this. I had the opportunity to be to watch the first one, and it was incredibly impactful and helpful for me and my growth, and challenged me in my own biases and the things that I go through. So yeah, like Jordan was saying, I'm half Guatemalan, half Salvadoran. And first generation. I actually did live in Guatemala for 4 years, and then I actually was part of ELL, and so I navigated something differently as a migrant person, navigating the system, navigating first generation parents and stuff like that. So I see this in a different way, and just like Dr. Adams, technically being Latino or Latinx is technically ethnicity. It's not technically a race. So there's a different thing, and to start with, the Latinx culture actually has tremendous amount of diversity. We have Afro Latinx or Afro descendants. We have Asian Latinx, predominantly from China, Taiwan, Vietnam, and Latin America, Japan. We also have Middle Eastern background. A big one is Shakira. She's Lebanese background, and then we have the mestizo, which what I am, which is essentially we don't really know what we are. And it's a combination of potentially Black, potentially Indigenous, and potentially white European or white Spaniard because of colonization. And then you also have your white Latinx community, which is also very present and stuff, and the Indigenous that have their own language and culture. So that's even how diversity, even the Latinx culture. So so even trying to zoom all this on like the needs and all that stuff is already a big question to ask, especially in an hour. And so I really hope that that you have a posture of listening and learning, but also have a posture of knowing that we're all trying to figure it out as we go. I think Dr. Adams and I are definitely have spent more time, especially in our respective communities, but also kind of addressing some of the macro and micro things that are happening in our world and how that affects us. So I think I'll just jump in with a little bit more of a personal note. I think throughout my life, I've definitely had symptoms of PTSD from my childhood trauma, from the places that I grew up with, and of course have depression, and I struggled with suicide ideation and stuff, and I came to a point that I was trying to discover how did this work, and all through high school, nobody really offered therapy. It wasn't something like you would get offered in school. And I went to GISH and stuff, and GISH is predominantly, it's almost 50% Latinx, I think, and we'll see post-census that Grand Island's probably gonna be close to 50 or 55 on the growth, and knowing that some of the behaviors I was kind of showing in high school was honestly a lot of trauma-based. I was, consuming marijuana. I was getting kicked out of school. I went to Saturday school. I went to in-school detention. I went all this other stuff, but nobody ever offered what mental health was. And people quickly saw me as this bad kid. And even the scripts that I kind of learned in high school being like, oh, you're just a bad kid. You're just going to be like everybody else. And nobody really offered that. I was actually going through a tremendous amount of trauma at home, and discovering what was going on, especially because I had just moved to the US, and I was in ELL or ESL and navigating some of this, and most of I would say my trauma was kind of being based on my behaviors, and I think most teachers and educators see the behaviors but not really see what is this brown kid actually, what's really going at home, and why, and asking the questions why. And I think that's why we're combining mental health and race, because often we put, especially people of color, especially brown and black children, as just bad kids, and actually not addressing some of the mental health needs of, like, there's trauma at home and there's stuff going on, or they might have depression, or anxiety is looking differently. They might be scared that their parent is going to get deported, or they're scared that ICE raid is going to come, and then what are they going to do, and so all this affects children in different ways. Or have a cousin or uncle and they're in a gang and trying to figure this out, or they're very low income, and all these different things that affects us in different ways. And that's why I think it's important to have this conversation of how mental health and how race affects us in a very unique way. And I think Dr. Adams hit a great point of, we use the same tools that help especially European men, being like, here, we're going to use this tool in psychology or in therapy, and go for it, and that doesn't work, especially in the brown and black community, or the Native community as well, and even the Asian community. That these tools, that we need to be more cultural competent in how we bring and how we tailored, not just racial and cultural diversity, but also the diversity within even mental health. Mental health is very diverse in itself, and then you add diversity within race and culture, and who is more assimilated, who's more connected to their ethnic identity, who is disconnected, and all this other stuff. And then you have a plethora of diversity within your session, and then you're like, okay, I need to tailor it, and I can't just use this tool that worked in the 30s with this white land owning men. Like, it doesn't work that way. And I'm seeing that as a therapist here in Grand Island, predominantly working with the refugee community, Somali and Sudanese, working with the migrant community from Latinx, from Cuban to Salvadoran, Guatemalan, Honduran, Mexican, to lower income community, and stuff like that. And so you have that combination, and I think it's important to address that. One, those same tools are not gonna free most of the people of color, especially if the needs of crisis and intense emotional strain is happening at home or in the communities, especially with the refugee and migrant community. They're not only worrying about what's going on here, they're worrying what's going back at home. If there's a civil war, or if there's a lot of gang violence, or if there's a lot of poverty, they're also worrying on what's going on at home. And that affects them too, especially if they're a source of income to them. $50 for us here is not necessarily a lot, but $50 over there is quite a bit. And a lot of those families depend solely on that. And I think in terms of access to race and access to mental health process, I think the first one is like the question I think most people of color, or Black, Indigenous, or people of color will ask, why therapy? Why should I go to someone that it will not understand the problems or the things that are going in my community? That'll be the first question they'll ask. How are you going to help me if my dad gets deported? That was, or how are you going to help me if I'm scared of being, shot or murdered? How's that going to help me? How's that going to help me in poverty? And that's one of the bigger questions I think most people of color ask at the beginning of things. So let's say they ask those questions and they're like, you know what, I want to try it. Then we got access to insurance in the healthcare system, which we know that's very broken, being like some insurances cover therapy, some insurances don't. And if you don't have insurance, then you're most likely not going to be able to afford $120, $150 session per session, you know, and that's average. You know, if you go to New York, some of these sessions are like $300, $350 per session and stuff. And so then we have the accessibility of the monetary accessibility of being like, okay, I can choose to pay rent or I can choose to look at my mental health needs. Well, I'm going to choose to pay rent and live afloat. I'm not going to look for therapy. So now let's assume like now they have insurance, they want to go to therapy, and now they're looking into therapy, right? Now they go into a therapist, and this therapist or this psychologist is not maybe cross-cultural, and they feel misunderstood, or they feel like they're using these same tools and just not feeling heard. They're quickly going to get turned off or leave. Or even accessibility to be able to get into therapy. In this case, in Grand Island, you know, in the Tri-City area, there's only 2 bilingual therapists, me and Adriana, in Kearney, Grand Island, and Hastings. And there's a lot of Latino community that speaks Spanish. And so that even the accessibility of having a therapist that speaks your own language, now you have that, or that looks like you and understands you. And so then we're running into that problem. And then let's add medication. Getting access to psychotropic medication is even harder. How are you, if especially in rural communities, if there's no psychiatrist and it takes you 3 or 4 months to get in, like, are you going to continue to do like all that stuff? So why insurance? And then like, you know, you get now to like not a cultural part. And then you add poverty, you add trauma and all this other stuff. And the saying like, why would I do that? If these first needs are not being met. So kind of tackled a lot. Dr. Adams, if you want to jump in or add into something I said.
No, I loved what you said there. And I think that even like if you were to pull up Google and you Google counselors in Omaha, you will see a straight line of dots that like is from east to west. You're not going to see counselors pop up in North Omaha, and you're not going to see counselors pop up in South Omaha, right? Like even when we kind of just like put that into the search engine, if somebody is saying, yeah, I want to do counseling, and they just like start trying to Google it, it's going to seem inaccessible for them unless they're in a specific geographic area. And I think that the monetary component of it is so important to think about, because we know that we typically see change in therapy around session 8 to 10, sometimes with CBT around session 6. So yeah, if we're talking about paying out of pocket for $80 to $150 a session for at least 8 sessions, that is going to price out a ton of people. And in private practice, practitioners can choose which insurance companies they want to accept, right? Or they can choose to accept no insurance companies and only accept private pay. I also think that like Psychology Today is like the website that's used to like shop for counselors. And so if you go to Psychology Today and you look at all the counselors in Omaha, just like doing a brief kind of look through the pictures, you are not going to see a lot of Black and brown faces on there. And so if you have somebody that is like, yeah, I think I'm ready to do counseling, like, I think that I want to do this, like, there's that kind of accessibility that Miguel was talking about. There's the price point that he was talking about. And like, if I go and I just don't see somebody that looks like me, that might be kind of a piece that immediately is like, this is not for me. And I think that we could go on kind of this entire spin-off on kind of the wellness industry in the United States, right? And how we've kind of packaged up wellness as this kind of yoga retreat on an island somewhere, or these really expensive supplements that you have to take every day, or this prepackaged food that's delivered to your door that's high in protein and low in carbs, right? Like, we've been sold this whole package of what wellness is in the United States. And when you look at the people selling that, they're not Black and brown, right? So we already have this messaging that like, wellness is not for you. You cannot afford it. It is not in your communities. The people that are doing it don't look like you, right? So we have all of these messages saying, this is not accessible to you. This is not accessible to you. And then we have the real data that shows that when people of color show up to counseling, they typically terminate counseling within a session or two at a much higher rate. than white individuals because they don't feel heard. And that is kind of a whole nother spinoff into microaggressions and our struggle with microaggressions in the counseling sessions, and the importance of being culturally humble as counselors in the counseling session. But I do think that like the barrier of even knowing it's accessible to you, to even getting into that space, and then getting in that space and truly feeling heard, I think are all kind of these spaces where we see people of color kind of not get access to healthcare, especially mental health care.
Yeah, and then you add cultural barriers as like patriarchal systems, and especially for people of color, I would say predominantly and Black and Brown and Asian culture, it's like males are not supposed to show emotion, and it's supposed to show hardship and resilience and tough it out and stuff, and that leads to a lot of drug abuse. Unfortunately, that leads to that, or domestic violence, or the cyclical part of violence, of intimate violence, or violence in the community. And so then all these younger brown and Black, indigenous, or Asian boys are asking these questions of like, well, my school's saying I should express my emotions, but at home they're saying not to. What do I do with this? And they have this constant turmoil, being like, well, I do want to express myself. And society in itself, patriarchy, is saying like, men don't cry, men tough it out, and men do this and men do that. And then so most of these boys ended up just coping in ways that are not healthy for them, that leads them into troubles that that they don't want to, and that is also very harmful. And I think that's something I'm very passionate about as a brown guy. I was told by my dad, it's like, we don't cry here, we don't express it, and you beat depression. He still does this, and this is funny, but he slaps his chest and he's like, depression got nothing on me. I got, it's just like, Dad, you're truly not, you're struggling here. Like, you can't just slap depression off, and so you have to add that particular part too in patriarchal systems.
Thank you both for sharing all that. I think a lot of people don't think about how much nuance goes into the idea of wellness in general. I think it's easy to have this misconception that, if something's wrong, you take a pill and you call your doctor in the morning and everything sorts itself out. But really what I'm hearing is that there's so many facets, many of them being cultural components or just tied to your very upbringing, that can shape your perceptions of wellness, as well as what kind of treatment works for you. I think this is a really good transition point to go on to our next question. Before, just encouraging folks at home to please use the Q&A tab one more time. Please submit your questions. We would love to hear them all. But moving into the next question, especially speaking to this idea of how our cultural background, our upbringing, as well as things that are happening around us can all affect and influence how we perceive our own wellness, as well as what we need to experience wellness. How are current events impacting the mental health of people of color in the country right now? Dr. Adams, would you like to take this first?
Yeah, absolutely. And I see many of my students kind of checking in the chat, and I'm very excited to see you all here. Welcome. And a lot of them heard this spiel from me this past week in my trauma and crisis class. And so I hope if they feel so welcome to kind of put in the chat what they want to add to this also. But I think when we talk about current events and we talk about people of color and kind of mental health and wellness, the conversation starts with thinking about stress and our stress response systems. And so when we think about stress, it is a kind of a natural biological process that has kept humans alive. It has kept us safe from the lions, the tigers, and the bears, right? Like, it has kept us safe from natural disasters. It is our natural kind of alarm system to say that something environmentally is off, and I need you to be on high alert and to pay attention to what's happening right now. And so most of the time when we're stressed, we can take a pause, we can look around, we can say, hey, what is it that's kind of getting me riled up right now? And we can use our internal coping mechanisms or external resources to help bring ourselves back down. When we aren't able to do that, that stress turns into distress, right? So this is a more heightened level of response that's like, I need immediate action right now. Like, you did not attend to what I needed. This lion is still chasing me. I'm gonna need you to kick it up a gear, right? Like, something is still going on. I need you to respond to that. And then if we don't get a response when we're in distress, that moves us into crisis. And so crisis is like an all out, I do not have the internal ways of coping with what's happening around me right now, and I do not have the external resources to help me with that. And so it is, in some people, we see almost this like paralyzed response to being in crisis, right? Like, I don't know what to do, so I'm gonna freeze. In others, we see increase in anger, in rage, in fear, and that is a lot of what we see with that kind of fight response. And so when we think about what's currently happening in communities of color, we were already seeing these communities fluctuating between chronic levels of stress and distress, just because of systemic racism, because of oppression, because of barriers that are already in place. This community was already really struggling to have the internal ways of coping with what was happening on a day-to-day basis and the external resources to help them manage, because of everything that we talked about in the previous section, because of the price point of healthcare, because of the physical location of healthcare, because of how represented they feel by healthcare professionals. All of these things were making it so that communities of color already had their kind of stress cup half full. And then we see in the past 8 months, a pandemic on top of that, which has really brought to light the systemic inequalities in our healthcare system, both in mental health and physical health. We see on top of that a lot of really high profile murders by police officers. We see on top of that kind of continued unrest in communities and a lot of very overt racism. And so all of this is kind of piling on top of communities of color that were already really struggling to manage and really struggling to have access to adequate health care. And so what we're seeing is these communities in crisis without the adequate resources to help bring them back down to safety and stabilization, which are our primary concerns when we have people or communities in crisis. And so when we see people in crisis with prolonged stress response, we start to see really long-term mental health impacts and really long-term physical health impacts. And so that stress response system, as adaptive as it is meant to be used in the short term, right? It's meant to be used to get out of the way of the bear. And as soon as the bear is gone, I can go back to normal life, right? But when we have these existential and big crises, like a pandemic that we don't know when it's gonna end, or like systemic racism where we don't know when it's gonna end, it never gives the body a chance to come back down, right? Because there is no end to that crisis. And so we're really seeing communities of color predominantly struggle with this because there is no respite. There is no space for them to come back down. And so in the short term, what is going to be happening is a lot of people that are like struggling to find ways to cope. And in the long term, I suspect what we're going to see happening is a lot of persistent mental health in these communities and a lot of persistent physical health that's going to happen, because that stress response system takes a toll on the heart, right? There's a physiological component of it. It takes a toll on our immune system. It takes a toll on our digestive system. Like all of these systems that are in place to keep us alive when we are in crisis, when they're overused, we start to see this detrimental impact. And so that is in general what's happening in communities in color that are in the midst of this kind of like triple crisis that we're having right now. And Miguel might be able to talk a little bit more to specifically what's happening locally or what's happening in the community that he's serving. I see a very small caseload of clients in the community, but have really been more focused on teaching about crisis and trauma and what this is happening kind of nationwide and what patterns we're seeing nationwide.
Yeah, and the way I describe it to my guys is like, you have this car and you're revving all the way to 100 miles per hour. You got no oil change, you got no air filter, you got no tires, and you're supposed to ride like that for the rest of your life, at some point your motor is going to break. At some point, you know, and that could look like through mental health, or that could look like through physical health. And so a lot of the guys kind of get it, like, oh yeah, this makes sense. So I like that analogy a lot, because that's essentially what's happening. You know, we can get to 100 miles per hour in our car. It was, you know, it's designed it, but we're not supposed to do it all day, every day, because that's going to get our car to break. And that's what's happening, especially in mental health and physical health. I think zooming into tailoring it to Nebraska and then tailoring it into rural Nebraska, I think something that we saw was the meatpacking. So that was big. So COVID-19 is still alive, it still exists, and we still have no vaccine. So so that, you know, that's the reality that we're in. And particularly here in Grand Island, and I think in Lex and the other rural towns, we saw some of the scapegoating and a lot of the xenophobia and racism towards predominantly the migrant and the refugee community that worked in the meatpacking places. And so in the media, we get like, praise the essential workers, right? But then we get the workers that are showing up to these meatpackings that don't have the proper care, and they're dying, and they're getting sick, and they're getting their kids sick. And at the same time, we're getting this mixed signals of being like, yes, keep doing essential workers, but then like was like, no, show up to work. And then you know, they're showing this concern of being like, hey, but then the community is blaming them for bringing COVID and being like, oh, it's the immigrants, it's the refugees, it's the brown people, it's the black people. And then in the coast, we saw a lot of the xenophobia against the Asian community, being like, oh, they brought it from Asia, and stuff like that. And that does something to you. That does something to you in your self-esteem, because you're like, okay, you're praising me because I'm in the ground, I'm doing all the work, you know, I'm in the restaurants, I'm doing the takeout carrying, you know, I'm doing all this stuff, I'm in the meat packing, I'm in the farm still, I'm still in the agriculture. Again, we're in Nebraska, our economy is still agriculture, we're still in the fields, we're still picking up all the things that we need to pick up. But yet I'm being scapegoated, like, and yet you're calling me essential, but yet you're saying that I'm stealing your jobs, and that, well, but then at the same time you're saying we're lazy. Like, I don't, like, where does this go? Like, I don't understand. And so we got COVID, right? And then now you have this tremendous amount of stress. Not only do we have COVID-19 stress because are we going to get sick? Am I going to die? But then you have the societal stress of specifically in Grand Island, where we're like, they were scapegoating, especially the east side of town, which is predominantly more brown and black, blaming kind of that community. And we saw that in Lex, we saw that in South City, we saw that in Crete, we saw that in Columbus, you know, all these communities that were getting scapegoat, particularly in this sense. And during COVID, right? So now you have the stigma of you're bringing the disease. You got the stigma of COVID-19, and then you get it. Let's say you get it. Now you have no resources. You have no means of capability. And now your stress level is even rampant. And now a lot of the things that I honestly saw a lot of, I had the honor and the privilege to work here in Grand Island, and the sad part of working with kids that had parents that had COVID, people that had COVID, my mom had COVID, you know, and so I kind of knew, I took that really personal, being like, I saw the psychological impacts it did to my mom. Like, my mom had it for 4 weeks, and I could see how detrimental, not only the physical manifestation of this disease, but just like the psychological part of being like, hey, I can't like hang out with anybody, you know, especially as a Latina lady and a Guatemalan lady. She loves community, she loves people, and we couldn't do that. And that's what's happening a lot. The only little bit of coping that we had specifically in the Latino community, which is making carne asada and going out to eat and like playing soccer or whatever, that was all cut off, you know, and that was cut off for all society in general. But that was a little bit of peace that they had. And now you're being blamed for all these issues, and now your trauma response is kicking in. But it was like a shot, and then now we're seeing the rest of it. You know, and so I had this opportunity that I led this support group of COVID-19 survivors, but also people that had lost family members or had family members with COVID-19. And a lot of the issues they were bringing up was this tremendous amount of trauma actually reminded them of undealt trauma that they had from either crossing the border to, you know, the sexual trauma that they had, or the domestic violence at home, or all this other stuff. And it was catalytic, and it led them to feel stuck. And like what Dr. Adams was saying, either flight or fight, and what they were doing, it was stuck. It's like, I don't know what to do with this. So that's a big, COVID-19 thing in terms of racism and xenophobia and how that affected the trauma. I think in terms of police brutality and, murdering and stuff, James Scurlock in Omaha was one of the bigger things, in particular in our community in Nebraska. And that was hard. That was hard predominantly for the community in North Omaha. I had the opportunity to live in North Omaha for 3 years during grad school and worked at the Butler Gas YMCA in North Omaha, in the heart of Omaha. And really got to know a lot of the community. And as I messaged back and forth, really not like a therapist, just as a friend and just like a coworker, really saw the pain of what this felt and what this looked like. And this tremendous amount of trauma of not only knowing that they happened in our town, but like watching these videos. And these videos just really, really do something to you, because you're like, okay, we can see it in the video, but people are still trying to like argue that this is not real. And so I think predominantly in the Black community, they just felt so isolated. And I think the Latinx community doesn't help, because we also, and because again, we're a ethnicity, not a race, we have anti-Blackness and we have racism against other Black community as well. And so even the isolation of that. So kind of varying all that. I said a lot, and so Dr. Adams, go for it.
No, and I think the piece that that really kind of struck me and that I'd like to expand on is that like re-traumatization piece of thinking about how the media has kind of perpetually re-traumatized communities of color, right? So these narratives that we see in the media about communities of color being lazy or being like super predators or being, right, like all of these kind of really toxic narratives, depending on the media that you're listening to. But I think broadly, you're going to see these toxic narratives in most media, and whether or not they're trying to do it, whether they're doing it kind of overtly or it's just kind of the bias of their reporting. And so, or just people continuing to repost videos, continuing to repost kind of stories of brutality, and thinking about this process of, yes, we want to share this information. Yes, we want to make sure that people continue to see what's happening to Black and brown people in these communities. And every time one of those videos shows up on my timeline, right? Like I don't watch it. I haven't watched a single video of a Black man being killed in the past 8 months, because I just know that would not be good for my mental health. That I am able to still stay engaged in this movement and still stay engaged in what's happening here without having that kind of stimulus. And so I also think that there's a component here about how we make sure that we are not overstimulating ourselves through media, not overstimulating ourselves either social media or through news outlets, to make sure that we're taking steps to take care of ourselves while continuing to stay engaged in these movements that are important for communities of color. And so that was just one of the pieces I wanted to add in there.
And there's so many stimulus, so many stimulus. And I think we had dehumanized this, and we have to humanize these issues because brown and Black people are dying, and that's the reality. And we could talk about the country, but we have to see this in a global perspective. Just what Miguel, Afro-Colombian, was killed by the police in Colombia, in Brazil, similar problems, and whatnot, Africa and Southeast Asia and all this other stuff. And those are some true things that's happening. And I think it's important for us that therapy not only brings healing to you as an individual, but it brings healing to your community, and then we can reimagine what world can look like. And I believe we can get there. We have to start with the conversation, and I think this is what we're doing. And I'm grateful for all of you that are here. There's a lot of concepts being thrown out here, and a lot of lived experiences, and so please don't get defensive. It's like we're sharing some of our pain, and Dr. Adams and I are choosing to be vulnerable here and choosing to show, hey, it kind of hurts to see our community distant pain, and we're supposed to be the healers, and quote unquote, of our community, and we carry a lot in itself to be able to see that. And we're choosing to be vulnerable, and choosing to give our stories, and choosing to bring that love and that hope in our communities that often don't see that type of hope. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that thought of like the mental health is not only a space for individual healing, but it's a space for community healing. And that is such a different like way of looking at mental health than like what you would have seen at the birth of psychology, right? Like the thought was that you're going to come into the psychologist's office and the healing is of a very specific part of a very singular human. And we're starting to see that like, this is not a singular piece. We are all part of these larger moving systems, and that as mental health, we need to be responsive to that we aren't just healing individual people, we are healing entire communities.
Thank you both so much for sharing your experiences and for being vulnerable. I think this is incredibly important to be able to share this topic. I don't think there's a way that you can really engage with this topic without kind of sharing some of your own vulnerabilities as well as your own experiences. So I really appreciate that you two are brave enough in this space to do that. I think it's doing a lot of good, and I really appreciate that. For the next couple questions, I feel they're a perfect segue from this conversation, and I'm going to combine a couple questions again, just because I want to save a couple minutes at the end to get to the participant questions, and there's some good ones. And the chat has some really great messaging as well. So I appreciate everyone for being so positive in the chat and the questions as well. But the next two questions are building off of this concept of how there is no standardized wellness, and how our environments influence the individual. So how do concepts like race, ethnicity, and culture impact mental health, treatment, and services? But before we get into that, what is intergenerational trauma? And again, these are really big concepts, but I think if we want to start at building off of what we just discussed and going into intergenerational trauma and how those affect concepts of race, ethnicity, and culture, and the intersection with mental health, treatment, and services, I think this is a great way to proceed. Miguel, would you like to take first go with this?
Yeah, I love this question, not because of what it stands for, because I definitely read so much on it, because I was so intrigued of being like, how did we get to where we're at? And we have to look at history. The ecosystem and the macro system affects us as individuals. So whatever is happening in an environment is going to absolutely affect us. And so what does that look like? That means we have to look at the history, and we have to look at how did we get here, and what are we doing? And we have to talk about colonization and slavery. That's a big thing. And often in our community, we want to like forget it and be like, and it goes back to that individualized type of therapy. No, let's just focus on what's right now here. Okay, here's some coping mechanisms. Don't be sad. Okay, here's some breathing. Cool, you're good. There you go. But that's not it. I think people of color carry so much tremendous amount of pain from generations, from colonization and slavery. Colonizations, taking from, the genocide of the indigenous community of the whole continent, and then the slavery of our Black community that led to the whole continent. This is a continent thing, no matter if you're Latino or African American and stuff. And so we have to address that. And that turned into, again, systems that oppress the community. So that led to trauma passed on, from sexual trauma, of women being raped to men being murdered in colonization and slavery. And so we have that tremendous amount of trauma. So then fast forward, right? Now we got that, right? We got, especially Latin America, these countries kind of rebuilding after colonization. They're free and they're trying to figure out what they do. Well, now you have, the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, all these other empires trying to still capitalize on some of a very land that's just rebuilding from all this stuff. And that led into a tremendous amount of poverty, which again, poverty in itself is a big intergenerational trauma. And then you have patriarchal systems, like I said. And then after that, now you get like, okay, we're free, now we're kind of independent, and now we have civil wars. specifically Latin America. You have all these civil wars happening, and then now we have war trauma. That's a different type of trauma than, slavery and colonization. We got war trauma. And, fast forward, civil wars are done, and now we got gang violence and murder violence, type of generational trauma. Now we have that. And then if you're someone that's from another country that came to the U.S. as a refugee or as a migrant, then you have that trauma of crossing the border, having all this determination. So you see how all this kind of goes through, and it's like we have not breathed. Like, even though it feels like 405 years ago, all this stuff kind of clicks. So so how do I give you an attainable example? An example is my father is from El Salvador, and he grew up in the Civil War in the 80s and 90s. And he became a popular thing called Los Niños de Paraíso, which means the children of the paradise. And so a lot of the children were a lot of 12-year-olds to 15-year-olds were being forced to be part of this military, to be civil wars. My father was one of those, right? So he not only had trauma, and so going up even a year above him, he had a trauma because he was an orphan. His mom was low income, had a lot of trauma, and he kind of grew up in the streets. He eventually had to join the military and had PTSD from that. And then it's me, right? Then he moved to the US, moved over here, right? All that, now that I'm a therapist, I can see, oh, my dad was really going through PTSD, and he was really struggling in his mental health. And that got passed into me. I necessarily don't have the PTSD symptoms, but I definitely have some of the symptoms of being aware, of being alert, of being that ultimately led me to have a tremendous amount of anxiety, and at some point depression. And that's kind of how intergenerational trauma, and we see that in epigenetics, which epigenetics is saying that, hey, some of those DNA gets passed on, and it depends on your environment if it gets manifested or not. And we see that in biology, that things get passed on through generation. We see that in psychology, things get passed on that. And if you're a person of faith, predominantly Christian, we even see that in the scripture, saying that, generational curses gets passed on, and you kind of have to work that, even in the faith realm and stuff. And so we understand that only in the spiritual realm, we understand it in the biological realm, but we also understand it in the psychological realm. And that leads us to the systems of where we're at. Tremendous amount of stress, still not being heard, still probably low income, still having domestic violence at home, still having all these environmental things that are affecting us now. And that's why we have high rates of depression and persistent depression and anxiety, suicide, PTSD, acute stress disorder, and all these other disorders that kind of come. So that's kind of how intergenerational trauma can, with the technical, but also kind of the storytelling. So I don't know if Dr. Adams is going to add or think I missed.
No, and I think that was a pretty comprehensive look at intergenerational trauma and the many mechanisms that have trauma kind of travel from one generation to the next. I think one component that I would add into that is that one of our main sources for resilience is intact communities. And one of the main ways throughout history that individuals who are privileged try to keep people oppressed is by breaking up their communities, right? Is by making it so that their communities are under-resourced and underfunded and are destabilized. And so when we think about that, I think an incredibly tragic example of that, right, is our indigenous communities, right? Like a stripping of land, a stripping of values, a stripping of names and families and communities and traditions, right? Like things that are passed down from generation to generation about how we handle stress, about how we handle hardship, about how we handle when a problem arises in the family, right? Like communities are incredibly resilient and insulated. Families are incredibly resilient and insulated. And when we start breaking those up, right? Like generation after generation, it's like we're having to reinvent the wheel. And that is not efficient at all, right? Because a lot of it is trial and error. And if I can have my mother say to me, well, in times of stress, it's really helpful to take a pause and take a deep breath and think about the generations of people in our family that have weathered incredible storms, right? Like that can pass down these stories to me, these values, these parables, these traditions on how we cope with hardships, right? Like when I have that builds incredible resiliency from generation to generation. So what we see a lot with intergenerational trauma is these disruptions in generational coping that's passed down from generation to generation. And so we see a lot of times that it's kind of like every new generation, you're just kind of flailing, like trying to get by, trying to gather enough internal and external resources just to get by. And so I think that's a major component of generational trauma is there's this loss of tradition, this loss of value, this loss of time, right? This time that we can really kind of cultivate strength in our families. We oftentimes see a loss of language, see a loss of religious traditions, which are also incredible resilience factors. So all of these ways of coping that are that kind of give us grounding, give us roots, make us feel like in times of extreme stress that we have a firm foundation are disrupted. A lot of times in communities of color, because of these kind of intergenerational trauma, whether it's colonization or whether it's slavery or whether it is intentional disruptions in education or intentional disruptions in family units, we see this a lot in in political or war-based trauma, right? Like we get rid of people's art, we get rid of people's sacred spaces, right? We intentionally disrupt communities. And what that does is that sets generations up for failure as they move forward, because all of these things that make resilient communities are gone. And you have to build from scratch generation after generation. And so I think in addition to this biological component of our stress response system begins to form in the bellies of our mothers, right? Like we see this kind of biological component about how well we can deal with stress, how resilient we are. We see this behavioral component of I'm always watching as a small child how my community deals with stress, how my family deals with stress. And for better or for worse, when we have parents that have had really stressful upbringings and their response is, we don't talk about it, right? Like I'm going to shield my children from this pain. We start to internalize that the way that we deal with pain and hardship is by not talking about it. That's not how we deal with it in our families. And so that becomes like the primary coping skill of how we deal with this. And that's passed down from generation to generation. And a lot of times that's parents trying the best they can to shield children from pain. But that's also teaching a way of coping with stress, is that we don't talk about it. And then the psychological components that I think Miguel talked about really, really well of that are passed down in communities. And so intergenerational trauma is incredibly complex. And again, it involves a systemic intervention to help us make sure that we're healing individuals behaviorally, psychologically, physically, we're healing communities. We're really putting focus on how do we foster strength and community-based resources, not from some kind of like savior that comes into the community and tries to build something, but how do we empower communities themselves to build up resources that make sense for them, for their kind of racial and ethnic makeup. So I appreciate you talking about intergenerational trauma, and I think there's some amazing scholars that have done some really great work in that area, and it's very complex and something that we're still trying to really understand how to make sense of it and what the best interventions are to address it.
And just to add that it's complex, and like with Dr. Adams said, we might start seeing change in session 7 or 8. You know, do you think we can solve all these problems, you know, in 8 sessions of all this tremendous amount of trauma and pain? The reality is no. And that's why therapy is a journey. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be there forever, but because then you add factors of resiliency, you have factors of motivation, you have factors of how ready is this person wanting to heal, and do they have that community resource to back them up? And it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of it takes community. And I think that's why Dr. Adams and I are passionate about being and sharing some of our voices, because we can't do it all. We need the community, and we need community of all colors and diverse backgrounds to be able to know that we want to heal as community. We don't just want to heal as individual. We need those resources, by helping our single moms, by helping our, our victims of sexual trauma, our communities, our refugee and migrant communities, our Black communities, and underserved, marginalized, oppressed communities. Like we need it all.
Thank you both for sharing about that. I'm just kind of sitting here reflecting myself on how every time you started to answer a question, I felt like I just became aware of how little I actually knew and how much more there is to discover, and how each of these concepts really builds on the last subject, and how there's so many different components and nuances that go into these things. So there is no real one size fits all approach, and it's all like Miguel was saying, it's a journey, and you don't know how long it's going to take, because you're constantly learning and figuring things out about yourself, and how that's it's going to take some time, and there's a lot of different factors that affect that. So let's move on to some of the audience Q&A. There's some really good questions in there. And I'm just going to go from the top of the most upvoted. For those of us who are educators, what advice do you have for us to help our students who might need support? Whichever of you would like to go first. I think you both would have some great insight to this question.
Yeah, so first I want to just kind of validate that being an educator right now is an extremely hard job. And so regardless of if you're K-12 or if you're in higher education, like you are doing tremendous work to support our children, our adolescents, our young adults at a really challenging time. I think even in the best of times, creating a culturally responsive classroom is very challenging. So now trying to assess the needs of each of your students, assess the needs of their family, because we know students don't live in a vacuum, and actually teach what you're supposed to be teaching, that is a tall order. And so I think for me, like as basic as it sounds, like really taking the time to listen to students, and when your spidey sense kind of goes up as an educator that something isn't right here, slowing down and asking questions. I think a lot of times kiddos are seeing things that are happening in their families that may be struggling financially, that may be struggling with basic needs, that may be families in and of themselves that are really struggling to grapple with what is happening in their communities. And they're struggling to have conversations with their kids about it. And so we see kids that have behavioral issues, or that kind of clam up and go inside themselves and become really reclusive, or we see a lot of different responses in kids when they have big emotions that they don't know how to manage. And so if you notice that, don't just pass it off as a kid, just kind of being a kid. Sit there and ask some questions and take some time to really figure out what's going on with them. And a lot of times it might be just listening, and sometimes it might be connecting a family to resources. And without having kind of a specific example, those are kind of my broad thoughts on that. I don't know, Miguel, if you have anything to answer for that.
And jumping into that, get to know, thank you, teachers. You're doing a great work in the midst of all of this, and being underpaid is just, we can spend a lot of time on that. But yes, I think the biggest thing I think is know your students, know this sense of how different they came, either post COVID or post like a school coming back. Like, has something changed? Have they noticed? Are they more withdrawn? Are they more loud or more quiet? Noticing some of these patterns, because again, most of these kids don't have proper coping mechanisms. They're trying the best they can, and I think getting to know your family, I know that's hard. Is crucial, because if they can come back and be like, oh, by the way, our sister had COVID, that's why he's struggling, or his dad got deported, that's why he's not doing so well. Now you understand what's really going on, and you can really assess and be able to help this child in that proper thing, and their proper education that they need. So knowing the family, I think is incredibly crucial. And most parents really do care for their kids' education, but sometimes, you know, if they're working 3 jobs and their own mental health needs are struggling, you know, some of this like things are kind of like, oh yeah, I didn't realize that he wasn't doing so good. So it's good to know your families and being involved.
I think like if you have the flexibility to incorporate some basic kind of wellness pieces into your teaching too, of like, so today we're going to start our lesson with taking like 3 deep breaths, and like during a 15-minute break we're going to get up and we're going to stretch, right? Or if we have some windows that we can open, we're going to go stand by the windows and feel the sun on our face, right? I think that sometimes when we think about wellness, we think about these like big things of wellness, right? Like I'm going to go get a pedicure, I'm going to go get a massage, right? But wellness is being intentional about building in like ways to fill our cup throughout the day. And so if we can teach children how to do that, and the way we do that is by modeling and being really intentional about it, about like, okay, as we transition from math to reading, we're going to take a short break and we're going to take 3 deep breaths, right? And so if we can teach kids how to interject little pieces of wellness throughout their day, that can be really, really beneficial. And I think even in the counseling session and in my classrooms with my graduate students, we do a lot of wellness activities. Every single class period in my crisis and trauma class ends with a wellness activity before the class ends. A lot of my counseling sessions either begin or end with a wellness activity. And so I think just interspersing some of those in an intentional way can also build resilience in kiddos and help them learn how to manage those big emotions.
I'm appreciating the constant reminders of kind of individualized wellness and how important that is for us, and just in little activities throughout the day, and how we should learn to incorporate ways to make ourselves connect to our own idea of wellness as well. I think this next question here is something that we've been building up towards for a while, and there may not be a good answer, but I think it's something that really needs to be discussed about. And yeah, so I'm just gonna go with the question. Is there a directory of counselors who are Black and other people of color? And maybe even if the answer isn't as easy and straightforward as we'd like it to be, maybe you can give some insights on how you can go about finding a counselor that's going to work for you.
Yeah, so I'm going to give huge props to my multicultural class this past summer. So we did advocacy projects, and one of the groups was assigned to help support the Black community. And so what they did is they built a website called thevoiceprojectomaha.com. And on that website is a directory of an almost exhaustive directory of all the Black counselors in Omaha. On that, it has their website link, it has their phone number, it has a link to how to get in contact with them. It also has a link on what are your rights, what does consent mean in therapy, what does informed consent mean, and it is a wonderful website. My students went above and beyond to build that, and so that was one of the things that they saw is how exactly do we get this information out there? How do we get it in an organized place? And so that is, I was very, very proud of them. They did a really amazing job. And so that is one resource that Omaha has now after they built that this past summer. And so at this point, I believe it's still exclusive to Black counselors. I don't know if they've opened it more broadly to counselors of color in general, but that's one resource I know that's out there right now.
Yeah, I one of the resources I gave, Instagram has been really good in terms of therapists that I follow, and they have some great thoughts. But I put there's 2 kind of search engines. There's Latinx Therapy. They have a podcast, so I also added on the resource, and they'll email that. But they also have an Instagram page, and they have a directory with all the different type of Latino therapists are across the country. I know that might be a little bit more expensive, but it's something to consider. And then also, I think it's Mental Health for Latinx is another directory that has other Latino or Latinx therapists. And then you can see their profile and see, of the gender, and also like, affirmative stuff that are the things that they specify. In terms of Nebraska, I think that website is great. I don't think there's anything else that I know of.
Yeah, I mean, on Psychology Today, I don't know if you can filter by race or ethnicity for counselor. I know you can filter by what they specialize in, and one of the specializations is like multiculturalism. You can look specifically for counselors that work with individuals in the LGBTQ community, that work with people in the Latinx community, that work with people in the African American community. And so I think that you can kind of play around with those filters also on Psychology Today. And that is a free website, and that will, there's a lot of folks on there. And so I would definitely take some time to do some digging and really make sure you're finding someone who's a good fit for you.
And I just sent out too, on Instagram, there's also called Melanin and Mental Health, and that's predominantly like a Black therapist directory that's national. There's a lot of great therapists there, so you can check that out. Use Instagram, use your resources. Instagram has a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you both. And then just a little, maybe, are there any questions that you could think of when you're looking for a counselor that would be good questions to ask, maybe to find someone that would be a good fit for you?
I think if you decide to go, don't be afraid to hurt your counselor's feelings and ask the questions. Ask him personal questions. Something that I do to earn the trust is like, what questions do you have about me? What do you want to know about me? Get to know that as unfortunately, as limited as Black and Brown therapists and Asian and Native therapists that we have, you can also, you need that nice fit. And find that fit. Find that, oh, I really feel comfortable. I really feel safe with this person. And you might not feel safe with me, and that's okay. You might feel more safe with Dr. Adams. And I'm not going to take that personal. So don't so make sure you shop around in terms of a therapist. That doesn't mean like change every time, but make sure that you feel with someone comfortable, because again, you're sharing everything. You're sharing from history, from trauma, from what's going on. And we really are honored to walk with you in that journey. And we want to make sure that you feel safe and you feel comfortable, because we don't want to re-traumatize you either or microaggress you.
Yeah, I second that. Typically when I do my intake sessions, I'll ask people what they'd like to know about me. And then after the third session, I'll do a check-in again and be like, so how's this going for you? Like, don't be afraid to hurt my feelings. It is totally fine. After 3 sessions, you've kind of learned what my groove is. You've learned a little bit about my style. And if it's not for you, this is for you, right? Like, then this is totally okay. And I will be very supportive in finding somebody that's a better match for you. And so I think that's important, that counselors practice from a variety of different theoretical orientations that look very different in therapy. You can have counselors that are extremely directive and skills-based and will come in there with worksheets and will teach you something tangible every single time. You'll have counselors that are a lot more, not necessarily unstructured, but a little bit more kind of freeform in the work that they do, that, yeah, me also, we're just gonna get in there and do some exploring. And so, yeah, and that might not be as comfortable for some folks. They might want somebody that's way more directive. And so I think asking those types of questions of potentially, how directive are you? Are you going to expect me to do homework in between sessions? We could have an entire panel on the differences between the mental health professions, but we have licensed psychologists, we have licensed counselors, and we have licensed social workers. And all 3 of those can function as a therapist capacity. And so, and all 3 of those have kind of different philosophical kind of lenses that they're looking through. And so I also think you can ask about training. You can ask them kind of what their perspective is on wellness, on what they hope to see from their clients when their clients are doing well, right? You can ask them like, so what is your indicator going to be that I'm ready to be done with therapy? And so I think that these types of questions will give you a little bit of an understanding of what that counselor's roadmap is going to be. I think the important piece is making sure that your counselor is licensed in the state of Nebraska, regardless of whether their social worker is, regardless of whether their psychologist. Provisionally licensed falls under that same umbrella. Whether they're provisionally licensed or licensed, that is kind of our bar for making sure that the state of Nebraska is allowing us to legally practice. And so that would kind of be the minimal qualification that I would look for, and then go from there on what personal fit is best for you.
Yeah, and Precious brings up a good point. Yes, you have to continue to tell, hey, everything you talk about stays here. And I think predominantly with people of color, we're like, are you sure? Because I've seen you in the grocery store. Are you really going to tell, especially if we live in the community here in Grand Island, one of the biggest things is I'm like, hey, if you see me at Super Saver, minding or eating a taco or eating a pupusa and like you feel uncomfortable, like it's a, wave and let, but I take this really personal and make sure that I'm not going to share anything, no matter my pastor, my priest, or my, partner or whatever. I'm not going to share any of that. And so that's something I say a lot too, and especially the first 3 sessions. And I think after a while, they're like, oh, okay, you're not gonna snitch on me then. And I was like, okay, obviously there's duty to warn, and there's other things that we would break confidentiality. But for the most part, I think the reassurance of being like, hey, this is a safe space, and I'm not going to share. And I think I call that trauma, that we don't trust people. And so I have to earn it. I really do. And I tell them, I have to earn your trust. I get it. You don't know who I am. And I want to make sure I earn that trust.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And we are running against the clock, but I do think we have time for one last question. And there's some really good ones, but there's some really big ones too. So I'm going to go with a question that you might be able to have some quick tips for. How do we encourage young people of color to pursue a career in mental health to increase accessibility for future generations?
Yeah. So I think one of the reasons that I went into education is that I literally went from kindergarten all the way through my PhD with never having a woman of color as a teacher. Never once saw somebody doing the work that I wanted to do. And I think in a lot of ways that made this job that I'm in right now feel very unattainable. In a lot of ways for me, that was really motivating to be in this space and show up in this space and show my students that women of color can be in this space. So I think some of the first pieces are that, like, if you don't see anybody that looks like you, I want you to know that you can still be in that space. You are worthy, you deserve to be there. And it might be more challenging to break through those doors, but you're blazing a trail for so many other people of color to look at you further down the path and to say, oh, I can do this. I can show up for my community in this way. I think it's been incredibly important for me to find mentors and support systems potentially outside of the systems that I'm working in, especially if the systems I'm working in are not super diverse. The University of Omaha is making great strides in being diverse, but I think that in a lot of ways, like, I've had to look outside of that system to find support and to find other people that look like me doing the work that I'm doing. So I very much encourage you to use social media to look for people that look like you and ask them how they did the work that they do. The University of Nebraska and Omaha has a wonderful clinical mental health program. That is the one that I teach in. That is the one that Miguel graduated from. And so I also think that once you get in those spaces, it's so important to continue to push the educators in those spaces to be multiculturally competent, right? Like, we can say that on our website, we can say that it's in all of our classes, but I need you to show up and, like, demand that we look at all these issues from a variety of different cultural lenses. And you deserve that, right? Like, as clinicians, to be able to competently go out and practice in our communities, you deserve that type of education. So I strongly encourage you to look at programs, to potentially look for programs that say that they have some kind of multicultural or social justice lens to them. If they don't, push and ask questions on what they're doing to help their communities to be socially responsive, to be social justice oriented and multiculturally oriented. And if you don't see people in those spaces, I do not want you to think that you don't belong there. You can find support outside of those spaces to make it feel more accessible as you move through them. It will be a little bit harder. I'm not gonna promise it'll be easy, but I do strongly encourage you to continue to pursue it, because we need more Black and brown folks in these spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for me, it was the opposite. I wanted to be in the community and say, and show up and either help in a group or with the community needs and stuff, and see like, oh, this person is human, and there's a healthy man. I think especially for boys, it was important to see like there's a healthy man out there that is educated, and that's a ripple effect. And I see that not only in therapy, when I see it predominantly a lot of probation kiddos. And then after a while, they're like, you know what, this job's kind of cool. I'm thinking about it. I was like, exactly. See, and I'm like, and you have all this trauma and all this story. I'm like, you have a great story, man. And they really start clicking that. So representation really matters. And I think Dr. Adams being in the program really, helps other, specifically Black children, to be like, I can do that, especially Black girls being like, oh, I can be a professor, I can be the boss. That's awesome. And for me, it was more like, how can I be in the community and be like, hey, look, I'm operating, everything's good, you can too. And a lot of the kids are starting to have these questions and being like, I can do too. But we also have to be real. It comes down to money. And one, we got to pay mental health therapists more, especially the nonprofit ones, like myself, because a lot of the therapists, predominantly people of color therapists, aren't a nonprofits, because we're like, well, you're not going to be able to afford a $200 ticket with me, so I got to put myself in a nonprofit. And so making sure that if you do come from a wealthier privilege, or you're part of a church, how are you donating to the nonprofits that are serving mental health needs? How are you not only just preaching the talk of like suicide prevention and mental health, but how are you using your monetary things to better improve your community? And I guarantee you that with more people receiving mental health, your community is going to flourish and it's going to improve, because it's going to heal. Like we talked about community healing. So you got to put your money in the pocket too. And if you are able to, sponsor, have scholarships for students, we need that. It's like it took me a while to get where I got there, and I had the privilege to have a full ride in my undergrad, but there's no way I would have been a therapist if I wouldn't have had the undergrad full ride. That's the reality. So it comes back to monetary thing, and if you have those resources, or if you can inspire a GoFundMe or whatever of inspiring your community to be able to create 3 free therapy sessions for low-income communities, that really goes through. If you're a pastor, a person of faith, how do you inspire your church to be able to be like, hey, we serve the spiritual needs, but we also need the emotional psychological needs. How can we give that tiding to be able to to sponsor 10 kids to be able to see therapy and stuff like that? There's innovative ways, and that's kind of the things I'm working on too. How do we do innovative ways? And that's how I've been partnering with local people here in Grand Island in particular. How do we get some of that monetary, not only to get therapy, but also how do we get some of that scholarship money too for kids that want to pursue this? I think you're mute, Jordan.
Whoops. I was just saying thank you both very much for your time. I think this was a great conversation. I think you both had really great perspectives. You shared a lot of nuance and a lot of ideas that maybe others wouldn't have considered before, and how deep of a conversation this really is. Really is just the tip of the iceberg, but I think you opened a lot of people's eyes on different issues that they may not have been aware of before. You gave a lot of actionable advice. I think everyone here today is better off for it, and I really appreciate you all for taking the time to do this. I'm quickly going to share the resources that you have all shared with me. And we will be sending out these resources as well in the follow-up email, and we will also be making this video available online on YouTube, as well as the center Facebook page, but we will send all that information out. So here are some resources for you to deepen the conversation. The historical roots of racial disparities in the mental health system, racial disparities in mental health and criminal justice, Black and African communities and mental health, how to combat the mental toll of racism. And here Miguel has provided a lot of different resources from books to people to follow on Instagram and Twitter, as well as some good podcasts. I encourage you all to look into all of these resources and get a little more information about them. But as we close, I would just like to turn it back to Dr. Adams and Miguel to have any closing words that you'd like to share with us. And once again, we are so thankful and appreciative for your time here. And we look forward to continuing this conversation in our own journeys.
Yeah, I don't have anything like super insightful closing words, just I'm very thankful to have this conversation. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have additional questions or if anybody who is listening to this wants to continue this conversation. And as always, please take care of yourselves and take care of each other.
Yeah, thank you so much for first like taking the time, an hour and a half to sit and listen on these very complex issues. We're working through it, and I'm just so incredibly grateful for you that are here. And my hope is that, again, you look out for your mental health needs and knowing that by you being healthy, your community, your family will be healthy, and our communities will be healthier. So continue to do that, and just thank you for that. And again, if you have any questions, again, reach out as well. But take some time, debrief. There was a lot of concepts being thrown at you. Dr. Adams and I have been thinking about this, studying this for many years, and so we can free thaw it, but a lot of it was like, oh, what was he saying, or what was going on? Make sure that you do that. And complex, and we can't make, it's not a simple solution. It's a complex issue, therefore needs complex solutions as well. So, muchas gracias y por todos los que vinieron a ver.
And I will be sharing both of your emails, if that's okay with participants, so they can reach out to you with any questions they may have. I would like to thank everyone that tuned in today, everyone not only on the Zoom, but also on the Facebook, and to future viewers as well who will be watching this recorded. We hope that you enjoyed this time and got some valuable information from it. And please reach out to Dr. Adams or Miguel for more information, or feel free to contact myself or Gladys Godinez, who is running tech. I would like to give a big thanks to her for having this whole ship sail so smoothly. This was a great experience. And with that, I will say, good afternoon, I suppose, and have a good rest of your day.